Jagger versus Donald, extraordinary. Now, front pages, and an equally extraordinary photograph on the front page of the Mail on Sunday. This is the Prime Minister, we're told, seen from the rear, lying on the floor, doing press-ups for the Mail on Sunday. Why? Well, we'll hear more about that later. Their main splash is billions to get Britain booming. As we leave Corona. Why do we need billions to get Britain booming? Well, the Observer says because the jobless total may hit 1980s level without fresh state support. They're talking about 3.8 million people potentially unemployed unless something is done. The Sunday Times has an interesting story going again for Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, who's under a lot of pressure over a deal with Richard Desmond. There's also a really interesting story here. The first local lockdown may happen as a result of a spike in Leicester, it is arguing. The BBC reported that as well locally. The Sunday Express, again the story, Prime Minister speeds up plan for Britain's new boom. And the Sunday Telegraph there, another number 10 story there. It appears that the Prime Minister is going to oust the senior Mandarin or civil servant in the country, and that is part of big change we're told is happening in Whitehall to focus Whitehall more effectively than it has been during this crisis. Now, Hugh, let's talk about that Mail on Sunday story. First of all, the Prime Minister, fit as a butcher's dog, he says.
Yes, indeed, and that picture on the front page showing the press-ups, maybe he's trying to demonstrate that he is back to full fitness, if people needed any convincing of that. In the interview, he's teeing up this big speech he's due to make on Tuesday about investment in the economy, billions to get the economy booming again. The familiar old reference to shovel-ready projects, we've heard that one before. But interestingly, there's talk of these 40 new hospitals, which were promised during the election campaign. We're going to get more detail of that. And I think people in the NHS will be very interested in England in what the detail is there. There's also a warning to people in England next weekend when pubs and restaurants and bars reopen that the Prime Minister will watch very carefully to see whether there's any evidence of crowds gathering that are not going to be good long-term for people's health.
Well, I know both the police and quite a lot of scientists are worried about the effect of pubs in particular. Lots of people crowding into small spaces so soon as the unlocking carries on. But you're a health specialist, and therefore, what does fit as a butcher's dog mean?
Well, we were just speculating about that earlier, whether it meant the dog was fit because it would run around the butcher's shop looking for scraps, or actually eating a lot of meat, which probably isn't exactly the message that needs to be got across to remain fit. Exactly.
Because we're also told that we're all going to be asked to use gastric bans. There's going to be a big public health campaign against fat Britain. Far too many of us are too fat.
Yes, the Prime Minister teeing up the idea of an obesity strategy. It has to be said, we've heard this before. There's been measures to restrict advertising talked about in supermarkets and TV advertising. That's already on the cards, but that was rather shelved last year. So if the government wants to do that in all seriousness, then we await to hear more details.
Well, let's turn, Karen, if we can, to the other big political story of the day, which is the Robert Jenrick story. You've spent a lot of paper, a lot of space in the Sunday Times on this. Just give us the essence of what you have discovered that we haven't known before.
Well, the Sunday Times is reporting this morning that officials spoke to Robert Jenrick and begged him not to approve the luxury housing project, which was being pursued by Richard Desmond, and that a meeting took place where those officials said that it basically wouldn't pass the smell test. And of course, that's because eventually it was given the nod just a day after a community levy, a day before a community levy was introduced, which saved Richard Desmond around £40 million. And so now we know that he was lobbied very heavily not to do it, but did it all the same. And of course, the reason that this has become such a story is because just 12 days after Robert Jenrick approved that scheme, Richard Desmond gave a £12,000 donation to the party. And lots of papers, not just ours, have given coverage to this story, and it's been now running for the past 3 weeks. And although the Prime Minister has said repeatedly that he considers this matter closed, it doesn't seem to be going away.
So this is becoming a kind of standoff of a traditional kind between number 10 on the one hand and the Major on the other, or Fleet Street as we used to call it, on the other. You've seen these happen before. Presumably something else needs to happen before Mr Jenrick's position becomes untenable. In other words, Boris Johnson keeps saying it's over, I've drawn the line under it, and there isn't quite enough, so far as I can see this morning, to change that.
I think that's right, Andrea. I mean, it used to be the case. I think there was always a sort of old adage that, you know, if you were on the front pages for about 11 days or more, if a scandal continued to break over that period of time, it was generally traditional that the cabinet minister would do the right thing and resign. But Boris has steadfastly stood by Robert Jenrick during this period. I mean, it's interesting to say there are other stories around this which are also now emerging around the relationship with Richard Desmond. And I think there's a couple of stories in other papers about how Richard Desmond was also lobbying Boris Johnson about his lottery, the health lottery as well. So there are numerous angles of this story, I think, still to emerge. But you're right, at this moment, Robert Jenrick seems to be safe for now. But what happens over the coming days and weeks is anyone's guess, because, as you rightly said, it doesn't look like the lobby or the media are giving up on this one.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to another gentleman who doesn't seem to be safe for now, Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor. He's doing both jobs. And the Sunday Telegraph story, clearly heavily briefed, must make very, very uncomfortable reading for him.
Well, I can imagine so. It's interesting that this story that his position was now looking untenable broke earlier on in the week with a suggestion that he may be shown the door sort of sometime in the autumn. Now it emerges, certainly the Telegraph are reporting, that he could set out his departure plans as soon as tomorrow. There's been some tension clearly within the sort of higher echelons of the civil service and Number 10 for some time, which was illustrated with the appointment of Simon Case, who was brought in as the Number 10 Permanent Secretary. And many interpreted his arrival as being a bid to sort of sideline Sir Mark Sedwell. Yeah. And of course, we know that Dominic Cummings has his sights set on a big shake-up of the civil service and told political aides earlier this week that hard rain was coming and that he was quite concerned about some of the failings he perceived the civil service had been responsible for during the coronavirus pandemic.
Indeed, it's a brutal business. It says in the paper that one source said Sir Mark was fighting to stay as National Security Advisor, but already seemed resigned to losing his post as Cabinet Secretary. He knows he's lost one half of his job. He's fighting to keep the national security one, but they want to take everything off him and give him a non-job. It's a brutal, brutal world. Let me turn, Hugh, to one other big story in the papers today, which is what's going on in Leicester, because we've been talking for some time about the possibility of local lockdowns, not only another national lockdown, but where there's a spike, one part of the country, a town or a village or a hospital area or indeed a whole city is locked down. And that seems to be about to happen to Leicester.
Yes, the story in the Sunday Times saying that in Leicester there is concern about the number of cases. This was flagged up about 10 days ago.
Our colleagues in East Midlands have been reporting this.
Exactly, but actually in the Sunday Times, Caroline's story, it's that the level of concern at the Department of Health has reached quite high levels, that Matt Hancock is watching this very carefully to see whether some form of restrictions might be needed. So that's moved it on quite a lot. What might that involve? It's not clear. Could it involve shops being shut, local school closures? There's also concern about meat processing, that industry, both one plant in the food industry in Leicester and other plants elsewhere, and increasing speculation that there is more of a threat there because these are cold conditions to work in. The virus might spread more readily, and also that people work very close to each other. They have to shout in loud noisy conditions. All of that is a breeding ground for the virus. So there's concern over that industry as well. Absolutely.
Caroline, another big political story this morning, of course, is the fallout from Keir Starmer's sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey. Now, Rebecca Long-Bailey stood for the leadership herself. She has been a very, very loyal senior lieutenant of Jeremy Corbyn. And there is some sense in the Labour Party this is the left under threat now.
Yes, absolutely. And many people have interpreted the appointment of Kate Green, who is Keir Starmer's new Shadow Education Secretary, as a real symbol of that. Of course, she ran Owen Smith's failed 2006 leadership bid, and has also been a very vocal critic of Jeremy Corbyn. There's been lots of discussion about this over recent days as to, really seeing Sir Keir Starmer now really stamping his mark on the party. But it's not all going to be plain sailing. It's my understanding that that long-awaited report by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission into the party's handling of anti-Semitism allegations is due to hit the table of the officials within the party within a number of days in order for that Maxwellian process to begin. So we're going to see another big sort of civil war within the party over the contents of that report. But at the moment, and certainly the Observer have written a long read on this, they're very confident that, Keir's sort of ruthless bid to take charge of the party and sort of make it very clear that the moderates are now in charge is seen as a very good thing for Sir Keir Starmer. And of course, we saw a poll out with the same newspaper last night saying that Sir Keir is now more popular as a prime ministerial figure for Boris Johnson.
Right. Well, a very, very big week for Keir Starmer as well as for the Labour Party. Thanks both very much indeed. So to the weather.